June 19, 1944, 140 miles west of Saipan, Philippine Sea. Commander Takeo Nakajima pressed his binoculars against his eyes until they ached, watching the horizon from the bridge of the light carrier Chiyoda. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from exhaustion or something deeper he could not say. Through the humid morning air he counted the silhouettes. One American carrier task group, then another, then a third. His throat tightened. 4 task groups, perhaps 15 carriers total. The numbers were impossible. According to every intelligence report, every strategic assessment from Combined Fleet Headquarters, the Americans could not possibly have assembled such a force. Not yet, not here. Japan's own mobile fleet, steaming somewhere to his west with Vice Admiral Ozawa, represented the entire operational carrier strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 430 aircraft, everything Japan had left after 2 years of brutal attrition. And there, spread across the eastern horizon like a steel curtain, sat an American armada that simply should not exist. The radio operator's voice crackled through the speaking tube. Commander, scout reports confirmed. American carriers launching aircraft. Multiple contacts. Estimate over 300 aircraft airborne. Nakajima's breath caught. 300 aircraft, already in the air. His own carrier, Chiyoda, carried 30 aircraft total. The entire combined fleet had brought 430, and the Americans had put 300 into the sky in what must have been. He glanced at his watch, calculating the time since the first scout report. Less than 30 minutes? It was not possible. Every principle of carrier doctrine he had learned at Etajima Naval Academy said it could not be done. Nakajima had served aboard carriers since 1938. He understood the intricate choreography required to launch a strike. Aircraft had to be brought up from the hangar deck by elevator, 1 or 2 at a time. Each aircraft required positioning on the flight deck in precise sequence. Engines needed warming, final checks completed. The deck had to remain absolutely clear for takeoffs, with each aircraft launched individually to avoid collisions. The process took time, careful, methodical time. A properly executed launch of 40 aircraft from a fleet carrier required at minimum 60 to 70 minutes from the moment the first aircraft reached the flight deck. This was doctrine. This was reality. This was the accumulated wisdom of 20 years of carrier operations, and yet somehow, impossibly, the Americans appeared to have launched 3 times that number in half the time. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American Fast Carrier Task Force that Nakajima observed that morning represented the culmination of a revolution in naval warfare that the Imperial Japanese Navy had simultaneously pioneered and failed to complete. Both nations had recognized, in the years following World War I, that aircraft carriers would fundamentally alter naval combat. Both had built impressive carrier fleets. Both had developed sophisticated doctrines for carrier warfare. But somewhere in the crucible of the Pacific War, a divergence had occurred. The Americans had evolved their carrier operations in ways that Japanese naval strategists had not anticipated, could not match, and in the summer of 1944 were only beginning to comprehend. The story of how this happened involves no secret weapons, no breakthrough technologies, no single moment of strategic genius. Instead, it concerns something far more prosaic and far more devastating. The systematic refinement of operational procedures, the ruthless optimization of deck handling, and the American willingness to fundamentally rethink assumptions that the Japanese considered immutable laws of carrier aviation. In 1941, when the Imperial Japanese Navy's Kido Butai struck Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier doctrine represented the most advanced in the world. The 6 fleet carriers of the First Air Fleet could coordinate launches of over 400 aircraft, a massed strike capability no other navy could match. Their pilots were among the most experienced and skilled in any air force. Their aircraft, particularly the Zero fighter, were technically superior to most American designs. This superiority rested on a carefully developed operational philosophy. Japanese carriers featured 2 enclosed hangar decks, allowing maximum aircraft storage while protecting the hangar spaces from weather and battle damage. Aircraft were stored, armed, and fueled in these enclosed hangars, then brought to the flight deck via centerline elevators only when ready to launch. This approach maximized aircraft capacity and protected vulnerable fuel and ammunition handling from enemy fire. The flight deck itself remained clear, except during actual launch or recovery operations. No permanent deck parking. No aircraft spotted forward while others landed aft. The deck was either launching aircraft or recovering them, never both simultaneously. This doctrine made perfect sense according to Japanese carrier design philosophy. Their carriers lacked crash barriers, the steel cable nets that could be raised across the deck to stop an aircraft that missed the arresting wires. Without crash barriers, the entire flight deck had to remain clear during landing operations. A single aircraft failing to stop would careen forward into any aircraft spotted ahead, potentially causing catastrophic fires and explosions. Therefore, Japanese procedure required that each landing aircraft be immediately struck below to the hangar before the next aircraft could land. This meant longer recovery times, but it also meant safety. It also meant that preparing a major strike required extensive time in the hangar decks. Aircraft had to be armed with bombs or torpedoes, fueled to mission requirements, engines warmed up, and final checks completed before being brought topside. Only then would the elevators begin lifting them to the flight deck, where they would be spotted in launch sequence. This process could not be rushed. The elevators could only move so fast. The deck could only accommodate so many aircraft at once. Physics and geometry imposed iron limits. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviators accepted these limits as the necessary cost of operating the most sophisticated weapons platforms ever developed. They had no reason to question this doctrine. It had worked brilliantly at Pearl Harbor, where Japanese carriers had launched 2 complete strike waves with devastating effect. It had worked at Ceylon, where British carriers had been overwhelmed. It had worked in dozens of smaller engagements across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. But American carrier designers and operational planners had been asking different questions. As early as 1939, when design work began on what would become the Essex-class carriers, American naval architects had incorporated lessons that would not become fully apparent until years later. The Essex design featured a single open hangar deck rather than 2 enclosed ones. This reduced aircraft storage capacity somewhat, but created a crucial advantage. Aircraft engines could be warmed up in the hangar itself, with exhaust vented through the open sides. This seemingly minor detail would have profound operational implications. The Essex class also featured deck-edge elevators, positioned on the starboard side of the flight deck, rather than on the centerline. This innovation, first tested on the carrier Wasp, meant that elevator operations could continue without blocking the landing area. An aircraft could be rising from the hangar while another was landing aft. More importantly, American carriers incorporated heavy-duty crash barriers. Multiple steel cable nets could be raised across the flight deck at various positions, allowing aircraft to be spotted forward of the barrier while recovery operations continued aft. A plane that missed the arresting wires would hit the barrier and stop, preventing it from ploughing into parked aircraft forward. This single piece of equipment unlocked an entirely new operational possibility: the deck park. American doctrine, evolved through countless peacetime exercises and then refined in the crucible of combat at Coral Sea and Midway, embraced a concept that Japanese planners had explicitly rejected. Aircraft could be permanently stored on the flight deck itself, not just temporarily during launch sequences. Fighters could be parked forward, folded, or with wings spread. Dive bombers could be positioned amidships, torpedo bombers aft. This deck park did more than just increase aircraft capacity, though it certainly did that. An Essex-class carrier officially carried 90 to 100 aircraft, but by utilizing extensive deck parking, many operated over 100 by late 1944. The real revolution lay in what the deck park enabled: simultaneous spotting and launching operations. While aircraft were taking off from the stern, deck crews could be positioning additional aircraft for the next launch wave. While strikes were being recovered aft of the barrier, fresh aircraft could be warming up forward. The flight deck became not a static space that had to be completely reconfigured between operations, but a dynamic workspace with multiple activities occurring simultaneously. The procedures required to make this work safely were extraordinarily complex. The choreography of an American carrier flight deck in full operations involved hundreds of personnel in dozens of specialized roles, all operating in an environment of screaming, engines, blast furnace heat from engine exhausts, and the ever-present danger of propellers, spinning rotors, and high-octane aviation fuel. Color-coded jerseys identified each crew member's role: purple jerseys for aviation fuel handlers, red for ordnance and crash crews, yellow for aircraft directors who guided planes with hand signals, green for catapult crews and arresting gear operators, blue for aircraft handlers and elevator operators, brown for plane captains, white for quality control and safety observers. Each color represented not just a function, but a small army of trained specialists who knew their exact role in the larger ballet. This system had been developed incrementally through peacetime training and war experience. The manual that codified these procedures, eventually titled NATOPS, would grow to thousands of pages. But by mid-1944, the system worked with remarkable efficiency. American carriers had developed what they called the deck load strike concept. Every aircraft needed for a major strike would be pre-spotted on the flight deck in optimal launch sequence. Fighters forward, as they would launch first to provide combat air patrol, dive bombers and torpedo bombers behind them. All aircraft would be armed, fueled, and ready. Engines would be warmed up. Pilots would already be in cockpits. When the order came to launch, the entire deck load could be put into the air with minimal delay. Fighters would launch first, climbing to altitude to protect the force. As soon as the fighters cleared the deck, dive bombers would begin rolling, then torpedo bombers. The whole sequence, from first launch to last, could be completed in 15 to 20 minutes for a full deck load of 40 to 50 aircraft. And because American carriers operated in task groups of 3 or 4 carriers steaming in formation, their launches could be coordinated. All carriers in the group would launch simultaneously. 3 Essex-class carriers, each putting 50 aircraft into the air within 20 minutes, meant 150 aircraft assembling overhead in a single coordinated strike package. By mid-1944, Task Force 58 typically operated 4 such task groups, 12 to 15 carriers, over 900 combat aircraft. The ability to launch coordinated strikes of 300 or more aircraft became routine. Commander Nakajima, watching from Chiyoda's bridge that June morning, could not have understood the technical details of what he was observing. But he understood the implications. The Americans had solved a problem that Japanese carrier doctrine considered unsolvable. They had achieved launch rates that Japanese procedures simply could not match. The mobile fleet he served had brought Japan's entire remaining carrier air strength to this battle, and they were outnumbered 3 to 1 in carriers, more than 2 to 1 in aircraft, and faced an enemy who could apparently put their entire air wing into the sky in the time it took Japanese carriers to launch a single wave. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, soon to be known among American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, would prove these calculations devastatingly accurate. Japanese aircraft losses would exceed 300. American losses would number fewer than 30. The battle would effectively end Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. But the true lesson was not merely about numbers. It was about what those numbers represented. American industrial capacity could build more carriers, more aircraft, more of everything. But industrial capacity alone did not explain what Nakajima witnessed that morning. The Americans had not just built more carriers, they had built them better. More importantly, they had learned to operate them better. The systematic development of deck handling procedures, the refinement of launch and recovery cycles, the integration of crashes barriers and deck parks, the color-coded organization of flight deck crews represented a kind of warfare that did not appear in any Japanese staff college lectures. This was not Bushido spirit or fighting morale. This was not tactical brilliance or strategic genius. This was simply the steady, methodical improvement of operational procedures. It was unglamorous, it was prosaic, it was devastatingly effective. In the years to come, historians would debate the reasons for Japanese defeat in the Pacific War. They would discuss resource disparities, strategic mistakes, code breaking, industrial capacity. All these factors mattered. But on the flight decks of American carriers in 1944, victory came down to something simpler. Better procedures, better training, better execution of the basic mechanics of carrier operations, the kind of advantage that could not be overcome by courage or desperation or national will, the kind of advantage that meant when Commander Nakajima counted American carriers on the horizon that June morning he was not just counting ships, he was counting the margin of his nation's defeat, measured in the minutes it took to launch a strike. Flight Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Maeda had logged exactly 92 hours of flight time when he climbed into the cockpit of his Nakajima BZEX-N torpedo bomber on the morning of June 19th. 92 hours. 3 months of training. At 19 years old, he represented the new generation of Imperial Japanese naval aviators, graduates of the accelerated program instituted after the catastrophic pilot losses at Guadalcanal and the Solomons. In another time, another war, Maeda would have spent 42 months in training. He would have accumulated 700 hours in the cockpit before ever seeing combat. He would have mastered formation flying, instrument navigation, carrier landings in all weather conditions, aerial gunnery, torpedo delivery, and emergency procedures until they became instinctive. But this was June 1944, and the Empire no longer had 42 months to train pilots. It barely had 3. Maeda's training at Kasumigaura Air Station had been compressed, accelerated, stripped to essentials. Basic flight instruction, elementary navigation, enough carrier landing practice to qualify, though not enough to feel confident. Torpedo delivery techniques learned from lectures and a handful of practice runs against stationary targets in calm seas. No combat tactics, no advanced formation flying, no night operations. The fuel shortage that strangled Japan's war effort had strangled pilot training even more severely. Every gallon of aviation fuel diverted to instruction was a gallon unavailable for combat operations. Every hour a training aircraft flew was an hour denied to frontline units. The mathematics were brutal and unyielding, and so 19-year-old Maeda, with his 92 hours and his 3 months of training, found himself part of Air Group 653 aboard the light carrier Chiyoda, preparing to launch the decisive attack that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. Around him, the other pilots of the strike force showed similar inexperience. Some were even greener than Maeda. Carrier Division 2's pilots averaged just 2 months of training. At least Maeda had 3. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This disparity in training time represented more than mere statistics. It embodied a fundamental asymmetry in how the two nations approached the problem of naval aviation. American pilot training in 1944 required 24 months from induction to combat deployment. During those 2 years, a naval aviator logged minimum 500 hours of flight time, often more. The training progressed through carefully structured phases. Primary flight training on simple aircraft, basic instrument work, formation flying, advanced training on operational aircraft types, carrier qualification with multiple practice landings, weapons delivery training, combat tactics, emergency procedures, navigation across open ocean, night operations. By the time an American pilot reached Task Force 58, he had performed hundreds of practice carrier landings, fired thousands of rounds in gunnery training, dropped dozens of practice bombs and torpedoes, and flown countless hours in formation with wingmen. More importantly, the American training system produced not just individual pilots but cohesive units. Fighter divisions trained together. Bomber squadrons developed coordination. Entire air groups practiced integrated strikes before ever seeing combat. The replacement air group system, established in April 1944, gave final operational polish to units before deployment. This created aircrews who knew their aircraft intimately, knew their wingmen instinctively, and could execute complex maneuvers under combat stress. Japanese training in 1944 produced pilots who could fly their aircraft and execute basic maneuvers. Barely. The consequences of this training gap became apparent within minutes of the first strike wave's launch. At 08:30 that morning, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa ordered the launch of 69 aircraft from his Carrier Division 3, 16 Zero fighters, 45 Zero fighter bombers, and 8 JIL torpedo bombers. As the strike formed up over the mobile fleet, coordination problems immediately manifested. Fighter bombers, flown by pilots with minimal air combat training, struggled to maintain formation with the fighters. The torpedo bombers, piloted by aviators who had never practiced attacking moving targets at sea, fell behind the formation. As the strike flew east toward the American fleet, passing over Vice Admiral Kurita's van force of battleships and cruisers 100 miles ahead, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. Kurita's ships, nervous after submarine attacks and lacking adequate identification training, opened fire on their own aircraft. The anti-aircraft barrage was furious but poorly aimed. 2 aircraft were shot down. 8 more were so badly damaged they had to turn back. Before the strike had even reached the enemy, it had lost 10 aircraft to friendly fire. The remaining aircraft pressed on, but formation discipline continued to deteriorate. Inexperienced pilots drifted out of position. Sections became separated. What had launched as a coordinated strike package gradually dissolved into clusters of aircraft with no mutual support. Meanwhile, 140 miles to the east, American radar operators aboard the carriers of Task Force 58 watched their screens with professional calm. The displays showed what appeared to be a massive raid inbound. Estimated number, over 70 aircraft. Range, 130 miles. Bearing 265 degrees. Closing speed, 200 knots. Contact at 09:57 hours. The Americans had nearly an hour to prepare. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from his flag bridge aboard Lexington, issued immediate orders. All carriers to launch fighters, every Hellcat available. The deckload strike concept that had been refined through 2 years of combat operations now demonstrated its value. Fighters had already been pre-spotted on every flight deck, engines warmed, pilots in cockpits, all fuel and ammunition checks complete. Launch commenced within minutes. Essex launched 18 Hellcats, Lexington 17, Enterprise 16, Princeton 12. The other carriers of the task force followed suit. Within 15 minutes, over 250 Grumman Hellcats were climbing to intercept altitude. The fighter directors, working from radar-equipped ships, began coordinating the massive combat air patrol. Fighters were stacked at different altitudes. A 1,000 feet to dive on the incoming raid. Others held at 15,000 feet as a middle layer. A third group orbited at 5,000 feet as last-ditch defense. Each fighter division knew its assigned altitude and patrol sector. Each pilot had practiced this choreography dozens of times in training and executed it multiple times in combat. This was not improvisation. This was doctrine, tested and refined. The Japanese strike, meanwhile, approached without any awareness of what awaited them. The obsolete radar equipment on Japanese carriers could not detect the American fighter screen. The strike leaders had no warning that over 200 enemy fighters were climbing to intercept. The first indication came when the Zeros in the van suddenly found themselves surrounded by Hellcats. The engagement that followed was less a battle than an execution. American pilots, with their 2 years of training and hundreds of hours of flight time, enjoyed overwhelming advantages. They knew their aircraft's capabilities intimately. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero in level flight and in dives. It could absorb tremendous punishment thanks to armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks. Its 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Against this, the Zero offered superior maneuverability and rate of climb, advantages that required skilled pilots to exploit. Maeda's generation of Japanese aviators simply did not possess that skill. Lieutenant Alexander Wratziu, flying from Lexington, intercepted a group of Japanese dive bombers. His combat report, filed hours later, noted with professional detachment that the enemy aircraft showed no evasive action, maintained no defensive formation, and appeared confused by the attack. In 8 minutes of combat, Wratziu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. He was not unique. Across the combat zone, American pilots reported similar experiences: enemy aircraft that failed to take evasive action, formations that broke apart under attack rather than supporting each other, pilots who seemed unable to execute even basic combat maneuvers. One American pilot remarked during debriefing that the Japanese attack was not a good one. Many Japanese fighter pilots were content to stay out of the action entirely. The dive bombers and torpedo planes lost all formation discipline once attacked, separating and thus losing any chance of coordinated assault. The slaughter continued for over an hour. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft flew into the American fighter screen. Wave after wave was decimated. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike, fewer than 20 reached the American carriers. Those that did faced a second layer of defense that proved equally formidable. The proximity fuse, one of the war's most closely guarded secrets, had been deployed on American ships just months earlier. Traditional anti-aircraft shells required direct hits or time fuses set to explode at predicted altitude. Both methods were notoriously inaccurate against high-speed maneuvering aircraft. The VT proximity fuse used a miniature radar to detect nearby aircraft and detonate automatically at optimal range. The result was a quantum leap in anti-aircraft effectiveness. As the surviving Japanese aircraft began their attack runs on the American carriers, they flew into a storm of anti-aircraft fire, unlike anything they had been briefed to expect. 5-inch guns with proximity fuses created aerial minefields that aircraft could not avoid. 40mm guns put up walls of fire. 20mm cannon added final point defense. The American ships maneuvered in coordination, their anti-aircraft batteries controlled by radar directors and sophisticated fire control systems. Japanese pilots who had trained to attack relatively defenseless targets found themselves facing integrated air defense that shredded their formations before they could press home attacks. Most never dropped their weapons. Those who did scored. No hits. By 1100 hours, the first Japanese strike had been annihilated. 42 aircraft shot down by fighters, 5 more by anti-aircraft fire, 22 others damaged and limping back toward their carriers, many of which would never make it. And this was only the first wave. Ozawa had launched 4 separate strikes that morning. The second wave, 128 aircraft, met the same fate. The third wave, 47 aircraft. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft. By nightfall on June 19th, of the 430 aircraft that had flown from Japanese carriers that morning, only 35 remained operational. 395 aircraft destroyed. More critically, 395 aircrews lost. Not all had been shot down. Many had been forced to ditch in the ocean when damaged aircraft ran out of fuel. Others crashed attempting to land at Guam, only to find American fighters had destroyed the airfield facilities. Some simply vanished, lost to navigation errors, mechanical failures, or fuel exhaustion. The method of loss mattered less than the totality of the destruction. Meanwhile, aboard Chiyoda, Commander Nakajima watched the aircraft return, or rather, watched the absence of returning aircraft. The deck remained eerily quiet, no circling aircraft waiting to land, no radio calls from strike leaders reporting success, just static and silence. By 1400 hours, the reality could no longer be denied. The strike had failed. not merely failed to achieve its objectives, but had been virtually annihilated. Flight Petty Officer Maeda's aircraft was one of the few that returned. He had never reached the American fleet, turned back after engine trouble and damage from friendly anti-aircraft fire. His observer reported seeing numerous aircraft falling in flames, American fighters everywhere, complete chaos. Other returning pilots told similar stories. Overwhelming numbers of enemy fighters, impossible to maintain, formation. Comrades shot down before they could even begin attack runs. That night, an officer aboard Ozawa's flagship wrote in the flag log a terse summary of the day's action. Surviving carrier air power, 35 operational aircraft. From 430 to 35. In one day. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier Aviation, built painstakingly over 2 decades, refined at Pearl Harbor and Ceylon, had been destroyed in 8 hours over the Philippine Sea, not destroyed by superior Japanese honor meeting unworthy foes, not defeated in close combat where Bushido spirit might compensate for material disadvantage, destroyed by a systematic operational superiority that left no room for courage or determination to matter. Better trained pilots flying better supported aircraft from better organized carriers, executing better refined procedures with better coordination and better equipment. The American victory at the Philippine Sea came not from any single technological advantage or tactical brilliance, but from the cumulative effect of doing everything just a little bit better and doing it at scale, and doing it repeatedly until it became routine. For Commander Nakajima, watching his carrier's empty deck that evening, the implications were inescapable. They had demonstrated a form of warfare that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. The decisive battle Japan had sought, the climactic engagement that would turn the tide of the war, had occurred. Japan had lost, not because its sailors lacked courage, not because its pilots lacked spirit, but because the Americans had built a machine, a system, an operational framework that transformed individual courage and skill into coordinated mass effect, and they had built it at a scale that made Japanese resistance, however determined, ultimately futile. The Japanese carriers that survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea limped back to their anchorages in varying states of devastation. Tsuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, carried fewer than 40 operational aircraft. Chiyoda and Chitose, the light carriers, had even fewer. The carrier Junyo had been damaged and could barely operate aircraft at all. Vice Admiral Ozawa's flagship, the brand new Taiho, largest and most modern carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, had been sunk by submarine attack on June 19th, along with Shokaku. Hio had been sunk by American air attack on the 20th. 3 carriers lost. Over 90% of embarked aircraft destroyed or irreparably damaged. Most critically, the trained aircrew necessary to operate a carrier air force had been annihilated. Of the pilots who had launched on the morning of June 19th, fewer than 1 in 10 returned. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover from this defeat. In the 4 months between the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers would sit idle in port, not because the ships themselves were unusable, but because there were no aircraft to fill their hangar decks and no pilots to fly them. The training infrastructure that might have rebuilt the carrier air groups simply did not exist. Fuel shortages prevented adequate flight training. The skilled instructors who might have trained new pilots had already been thrown into combat and killed. The industrial capacity to produce replacement aircraft was being systematically destroyed by American bombing raids. When the remaining Japanese carriers sortied for the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, they carried fewer than 100 aircraft among them, and these carriers operated purely as decoys. Their mission was simply to draw American forces away from the main Japanese surface fleet. They succeeded in this mission, but at the cost of 4 more carriers sunk, including Tsuikaku. After Leyte Gulf, Japanese carrier aviation ceased to exist as an operational force. The surviving carriers remained in port for the duration of the war. Some were sunk at anchor by American air raids. Others were damaged beyond repair and scrapped after the war. The era of Japanese naval aviation, which had begun so brilliantly at Pearl Harbor, and reached its zenith in the Indian Ocean Campaign of 1942, ended in the Philippine Sea in June 1944, not with a climactic last stand, but with a systematic destruction that left no room for honor or glory, only the cold mathematics of operational inferiority. For Commander Nakajima, who survived the war, the memory of those empty flight decks would define his understanding of defeat, not the moment of surrender, not the occupation, but the realization, watching his carrier's deck remain empty hour after hour on June 19th, that Japan had been beaten not by enemy courage, but by enemy systems. Meanwhile, the American carriers of Task Force 58 continued their advance across the Pacific with barely a pause. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had cost the Americans 33 aircraft in combat, and another 80 lost to fuel exhaustion during the long-range night recovery on June 20th. These losses were replaced within days. Fresh aircraft flew off escort carriers. Replacement pilots arrived from the training pipeline. Damaged carriers rotated to rear area bases for repairs, while sister ships took their place in the task force. Within a week of the Philippine Sea battle, Task Force 58 was striking targets in support of the Mariana Islands invasion. Within a month, American forces had secured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. By September, American bombers operating from Marianas bases would begin the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The Essex-class carriers had enabled this advance. By war's end in August 1945, 17 Essex-class carriers had entered service, with 15 reaching the combat zone before hostilities ceased. Together with the 9 Independence-class light carriers and the older pre-war carriers, they had formed the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Task Force 58, at its peak, comprised 15 carriers, carrying over 900 combat aircraft, supported by 7 battleships, 20 cruisers, and over 60 destroyers. This force could project more striking power than some entire national air forces, and it was merely one component of the American Pacific Fleet. The Essex-class carriers participated in every major Pacific campaign from late 1943 onward. They provided air cover for the Gilbert Islands invasion. They struck Truk, destroying Japanese naval air power in the Carolines. They supported the Marshall Islands campaign. They dominated the Marianas operation. They covered the Philippines invasion. They struck Japanese home islands repeatedly. They supported the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns. Throughout this offensive, not a single Essex-class carrier was sunk. Several were severely damaged, particularly by kamikaze attacks late in the war. USS Franklin suffered catastrophic damage from bombs that penetrated her hangar deck, while aircraft were being armed and fueled, killing over 800 crew members. But even Franklin, dead in the water and burning, did not sink. American damage control procedures and the robust design of the Essex class enabled her to reach port under her own power. USS Bunker Hill suffered similar damage from kamikaze strikes. She, too, survived. The Essex class proved nearly impossible to sink, a tribute both to their design and to the training of their damage control crews. This survivability had been built into the ships from their original conception. The designers had studied the lessons of carrier combat at Coral Sea and Midway. They had incorporated armor protection, improved compartmentalization, better damage control systems, and redundant engineering plants. These features, combined with crews trained to fight fires and flooding, meant that Essex-class carriers could absorb punishment that would have sunk earlier designs. The significance of the Essex class extended far beyond World War II. After the war, most were placed in reserve, but the Korean War brought many back to active service. Between 1950 and 1953, 11 Essex-class carriers operated in Korean waters, providing crucial air support for United Nations forces. Their aircraft struck North Korean and Chinese positions, interdicted supply lines, and provided close air support for ground troops. The coming of jet aircraft might have rendered the Essex class obsolete, but instead they adapted. Beginning in the early 1950s, many Essex-class carriers underwent extensive modernization. The SCB 27 program strengthened flight decks, upgraded catapults and arresting gear, improved aviation fuel systems, and enhanced electronics. The SC 125 program added angled flight decks, enclosed hurricane bows, and better aircraft handling equipment. These modifications, incorporating lessons from British carrier innovations, transformed World War II-era carriers into platforms capable of operating early jet aircraft. The angled flight deck proved particularly revolutionary. Previous carriers had required the entire flight deck to be clear during landing operations. A plane that missed the arresting wires would crash into aircraft parked forward, often causing catastrophic fires. The angled deck placed the landing area at an angle to the ship's centerline, allowing aircraft that missed the wires to accelerate and go around for another approach without hitting parked aircraft. This innovation, combined with stronger catapults and improved arresting gear, meant that Essex-class carriers could operate jet fighters and attack aircraft that would have been impossible on the original straight-deck configuration. Modernized Essex-class carriers served throughout the 1950s and into the Vietnam War. They launched strikes against North Vietnamese targets. They provided air support for ground forces. They conducted search and rescue operations. Some were converted to anti-submarine warfare carriers, operating helicopters, and submarine hunting aircraft. Others became amphibious assault ships, launching marine helicopter operations. The last Essex-class carrier to serve on active duty was USS Lexington, which operated as a training carrier out of Pensacola, Florida, until 1991. For 20 years, naval aviators learned carrier landings on Lexington's deck, the same basic procedures that had been developed in World War II and refined through decades of operation. When Lexington was finally decommissioned, nearly 50 years had passed since the lead ship of the class entered service. No other class of aircraft carrier had served so long or so well. 4 Essex-class carriers survive today as museum ships: USS Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina, USS Intrepid in New York City, USS Hornet in Alameda, California, USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. Visitors walking these decks can still see the basic layout that enabled the revolutionary flight operations of 1944, the deck parks that allowed simultaneous spotting and launching, the deck edge elevators that permitted continuous operations, the island structure that housed radar and flight control, the arresting gear and catapults that made high-tempo operations possible. But the real legacy of the Essex class lies not in preserved ships, but in the operational concepts they embodied: the systematic development of deck handling procedures, the integration of radar into fighter direction, the coordination of multi-carrier task groups, the logistics systems that kept carriers operating for months at a time, far from home bases, the damage control procedures that kept ships fighting after catastrophic damage. These innovations, developed and refined on Essex-class carriers, became the foundation of modern carrier aviation. Every American supercarrier operating today, from the Nimitz class to the Gerald R. Ford class, embodies principles first proven on the Essex class. The basic choreography of flight deck operations, the color-coded organization of deck crews, the integration of launch and recovery cycles, the coordination between the carrier air traffic control center and aircraft in flight. Even the fundamental concept of the carrier task group, with multiple carriers operating together under coordinated command, derives from the Task Force 58 operations of 1944 and 1945. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated these principles under the most demanding combat conditions. American carriers launched over 400 aircraft in coordinated strikes. They recovered aircraft at night under emergency conditions. They maintained combat air patrol continuously throughout the battle. They adapted to changing tactical situations. They achieved operational tempos that Japanese forces could not match or counter. This operational superiority, more than any single technological advantage, determined the outcome of the Pacific War's carrier battles. Better procedures, better training, better coordination, the unglamorous fundamentals of military operations, executed at scale, repeatedly, until they became routine. For Flight Petty Officer Maeda, who survived the war and lived into old age in post-war Japan, the memory of June 19, 1944 never faded. The confusion of the strike, the overwhelming numbers of American fighters, the systematic destruction of his unit. In interviews decades later, he spoke not with bitterness, but with a kind of wonder at what he had witnessed. The Americans had simply been better organized, better trained, better equipped. It was, he reflected, as though they had been fighting two different wars. The Japanese fought with courage and determination, qualities they possessed in abundance. But the Americans fought with systems and procedures that made individual courage less relevant. It was a lesson about modern warfare that Japan had failed to learn in time, and by the time they understood it, the war was already lost. That understanding came to Commander Nakajima on June 19th, watching empty skies from Chiyoda's bridge. It came to Admiral Ozawa, writing in his flag log that evening about 35 surviving aircraft. It came to Flight Petty Officer Maeda, one of the few who returned from the slaughter, and it came, eventually, to the Japanese naval staff in Tokyo, though by then it was far too late to matter. The decisive battle they had sought had occurred, but it had been decided not by the climactic clash of fleets they had envisioned, but by the systematic operational superiority of an enemy who had learned to do everything just a little bit better, and to do it at a scale that made Japanese resistance, however determined, ultimately futile. The Essex-class carriers that enabled this victory were not wonder weapons. They were not invincible superships. They were simply very good carriers, designed intelligently, built in numbers, operated by well-trained crews, and employed according to doctrine that had been tested and refined through years of peacetime exercises and months of combat experience. This combination, prosaic as it sounds, proved decisive, not through any single brilliant stroke, but through the cumulative weight of doing the fundamentals correctly, repeatedly, until superiority became inevitable. That, perhaps more than any other lesson, is the legacy of the Essex class and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Modern warfare is won not by heroes alone, but by systems, not by individual brilliance, but by collective competence, not by desperate courage, but by methodical excellence. The Americans understood this in 1944. And the difference between understanding and learning, between preparation and desperation, was measured in the minutes it took to launch a strike and in the fate of empires. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.